Everyone, Wayne Fox here. I've got my trusty old Mac Pro here, referred to by most as the trash can Mac Pro. I've never used that term. I'm not sure why we attach derogatory term to things. It's a nice little round thing. It's different than other computers, but it's a pretty cool looking design and actually was very functional. The problem is I don't think Apple realized it's not really about expansion cards, because most people that use one of these really didn't need an expansion card. Yeah, there are power users that wanted to do it, and the graphics cards got bigger. I think Apple didn't figure it's not easy for them to upgrade it as technology got better, mainly because of the graphics cards. They're huge now, and so unfortunately the form factor didn't fit. That was really more. But to be honest, I think what I'd really love Apple would do is they would come out and put a computer like this. A Mac Mini is way too underpowered. The Mac Pro is way too overkill for just so many people, especially photographers. And they really need I think that they would sell this machine or an enhanced Mac Mini that had really, I don't need an iMac with a display. I don't want an Apple display because I want to use high-end, high-gamma displays. And there's a lot of people that don't want to use an Apple display, but they still want to put a Mac on it. So they should have probably figured out a way to make this form factor middle of the road for those people that don't need a PCI expansion. I mean, I've never, bought a PCI card for a Mac Pro before. Anyway, bottom line is I've done some videos about the performance of MacBook Pros. I recently did one comparing 5 MacBook Pros from different years and how they performed. And it was mainly geared toward photographers. It was Lightroom and Photoshop tests. And at that point, I actually standardized the test so I can run it on any Mac I want now. And I was on a couple forums and they were wondering if their trusty Mac Pro that they've got like this, at what point does a MacBook Pro outperform it? And to be honest, it definitely does. Now, this is the 6-core version. I don't know if the 12-core might do better with Lightroom, won't do much better with Photoshop. And it's got 64 gigabytes of RAM, which is what you can get in a current MacBook Pro now. So I thought, I can run those tests and compare it. So what I've done in this video is I've run the same set of 6 tests, and we're going to take a look at how it stacks up time-wise in each of those tests against those 5 MacBook Pros. And I'll show you a few of the little graphs and show you some of the screen capture that shows how the processors are performing and how well they're being utilized. And give you an idea if you've got a 2017 or earlier MacBook Pro, this is probably still going to beat it. But if you don't want to watch the video, from 2018 on, all the MacBook Pros from 2018 on outperform this, and the current 16-inch MacBook Pro outperforms it by a decent amount. I don't know, 20-25%. Anyway, let's go take a look at the data, and we'll see and go from there.
Okay, quickly, I'll just throw up the specs of the original computers that I tested. These were 5 years of generations of MacBook Pros. One thing I need to note here is that the 2016 MacBook Pro, as I listed in the original video, turns out it was actually a 2017 MacBook Pro. As I was messing around with it, I discovered that. I'd always assumed it had been sitting around for a while. And so that is interesting because performance-wise, it still lags behind the Mac Pro, but well behind the current MacBook Pros. The reason the 2013 Mac Pro is listed here in this specs is because that's where it actually falls in line regarding its performance, as you'll see in a minute. This particular Mac Pro was equipped with a 3.5 gigahertz 6-core Xeon E5 processor. It was equipped with 64 gigabytes of 1866 megahertz DDR3 RAM. In the original video, we talked about the RAM and the difference between DDR4 and DDR3, which I didn't know. And I assumed that DDR4 was a better generation and thus was faster, and that was wrong on my part. From what I can tell with my limited knowledge of electronics, but in reading specifications, DDR4 RAM operates at a slightly lower voltage than DDR3 RAM, so it's more suitable for portable installations like MacBook Pros. The DDR3 consumes a little more power, but speed-wise, they're almost the same as far as performance. I believe I even read some that the DDR3 actually will outperform DDR4, but it's a pretty minor difference. So that really is an irrelevant fact from what I can tell. The other point, though, this is 1866 megahertz, so it operates substantially slower. And the one thing that I've discovered through all the tests is despite the change in processors, it seems like possibly a more important factor to gain speed over the years has been the increase in speed of the RAM. And at this point, the current MacBook Pro has 2666 megahertz RAM, which is substantially faster than the original Mac Pro's 1866. And that's the only explanation I can see for some of the changes. For example, the 2019 and the 16-inch MacBook Pro really should perform almost identically. The only difference is the graphics card, which is kind of irrelevant, as we'll see in a second, and the more RAM, but the slight speed increase in the RAM, I think probably is what accounts for the reason it outperforms it. Back to the Mac Pro, it was equipped with two AMD FirePro D500 3GB graphics cards. The original Mac Pro was available with three different cards, a D300, a D500, and a D700. Because Lightroom and Photoshop, neither one really leveraged GPUs at all, I went with the middle one, and I basically did that because I did do some video work back then, although not as much as I do now. And I don't think this really has much influence on the test. And last of all, it only had a 500 gigabyte SSD because I pretty much used all external storage of this Mac Pro. Anyway, let's take a look at basic setup. Just a quick reminder. So I formatted the drive and installed a fresh version of the OS. I recorded the times by shooting a video with a 4K camera. Unfortunately, because I didn't have a good display to photograph it on, I just had a normal resolution display. It's not as clear as the others were, but I can still see the results and watch and monitor all the things. I was running Intel Power Gadget, Activity Monitor, and Max Fan Control, and these were all visible during the test, so I could monitor exactly what the CPU was doing, watch the temperature, things like that. And finally, all machines were running macOS Catalina 10.15.2, Lightroom Classic 9.1, and Photoshop 2020. All right, let's get on test one. I imported 500 Sony A7R4 files. These are 61 megapixel files. It was previews are set to sidecar and embedded. This is the fastest way to get files off your card into your computer. The files are on an external Thunderbolt SSD, and they're being copied to an internal SSD, so it's mimicking what you would do in the field. Although in the field, I think most SD cards won't be read quite as quickly. You'll see that the 2013 Mac Pro in this particular test is about the same as the 2015 MacBook Pro, and it really doesn't stack up. The one thing I'll say here is that the difference between 1 minute and 49 seconds, and yeah, that's 30 seconds difference, but this is in a 3-minute task. It's one thing to be difference between 5 minutes and 8 minutes. So a 25% gain on a 2-minute task isn't as significant as a 25% gain is on a 8 or 10-minute task. Also, in this particular case, most of the overhead is system OS level and not actually Lightroom, because it's all of the copying of the files. On test 2, we made one-to-one previews of all 500 files. This is something that Lightroom is very good at using multiple cores for. And here we can see that the Mac Pro held its own against the 3 most recent MacBook Pros. And when I bought the 2018 MacBook Pro and decided to quit using the Mac Pro, I was of the opinion then that the MacBook Pro had surpassed my Mac Pro. I had no real evidence to prove this, and I never really ran any tests. I was just tired of having to worry about 2 different computers. And this bears it out, that my 2018 MacBook Pro is actually faster in performing quite a few, well, everything it does is actually faster. So at this point, anything newer than a 2018 or newer MacBook Pro will outperform a 2013 Mac Pro as equipped in this test. In the third test, we actually exported all of those files. None of the files were modified in the develop module. We set it to be a JPEG 60 and resized to 400 pixels on the long side to export those files. And here we'll see that the Mac Pro was actually slightly faster than the 2018 MacBook Pro, and part of that could be system overhead. I'm not sure, because that's writing all those files to disk. But here again, it held its own. It wasn't like the 16-inch MacBook Pro or the 2019 blew it away. But this is a little more significant because now you are talking 2 minutes of savings, almost 2.5 minutes of savings in a 10 or 12 minute task. So the next test, we modified those files. So we exported all 500 files again, but they were modified. In this case, I applied a few global changes. I added 10 spots for spot removal. I added 2 minor graduated filters. And then I synced this same change to all files. And this was accomplished because I had the .xmp sidecar file from the original computer that I did the first test on. I actually copied to the machine, read it from the drive, and then I sync it across. So basically, I'm certain this test is a true test across all machines the way that I did it. And again, it's set to be JPEG 60 and 4,000 pixel long side, so same as the last test as far as export. And as we found the last time, this is significantly longer task. It takes a lot longer for Lightroom to render these out. So the rendering process is very intensive. The processor cores all work pretty much at full capacity, especially in the 3 new machines. Not quite as good in the 2013 Mac Pro. I'll show that in a minute, but it's still running at least a 90% efficiency rate or more for most of this test. The 5th test was to create 5 panoramas. Basically, I used the new batch capability in Lightroom. These are all from a Phase One IQ180 camera, so they're 80 megapixel files. Some of the panels had 6, some had 7, and the biggest one had 12. There were 5 panels altogether. I selected all at the same time and told it to batch create those panels. And the results of this test show that the Mac Pro came in at 8 minutes and 33 seconds, so about 25% slower than the 16-inch MacBook Pro. And again, the 3 most recent MacBook Pros outperform it, but relatively speaking, it still held its own, and it was still substantially better than the 2017 and I assume 2016 MacBook Pro. I don't have that one to test. You know, the one thing I will say is that, yeah, buying a MacBook Pro will outperform your current Mac Pro if you've got a 2013 Mac Pro, but it's not going to blow it out of the water. If you have a 2017 MacBook Pro, then any current one will actually blow it out of the water for most tests. And the last test was the Puget Systems 2019 Photoshop benchmark test. This is actually a really good test. It runs through just about everything Photoshop does. And it gives I timed it, but it also gives a score on the tests. And I haven't really put the scores up, but I think I might do that after I get this piece done. Maybe I'll grab those scores and throw up a graphic. Anyway, here you can see that the 2013 Mac Pro took 34 minutes to run that test. So it's 6 minutes slower than the 16-inch MacBook Pro. This isn't too surprising because this, with Photoshop, most of the work is only being done by 1 or 2 processors. I would guess 30% of the time is Photoshop actually leveraging quite a few of the cores. And even when it does, it never leverages them to the full. 3.5 gigahertz CPU is definitely an advantage. As I mentioned, the 16-inch and the 2019 MacBook Pro, they're actually going to, in Photoshop, they really run at about 4 to 4.2 gigahertz. And that's, I believe, why they're beating them, because they actually can run faster than the Mac Pro, because I don't believe it overclocks to near that speed. So anyway, let's take a look at some of the data and let me compare some of the charts. So if you're interested in how well it uses the cores and any of that kind of stuff. All right, so here we have the import test. As I scroll through this test, watch the processor history on the left. And again, you'll see that there's a significant amount of red. And the red is a processor that's being used by the operating system itself. In this particular test, we're copying files and we're writing files, so there's a significant amount of operating system overhead. The one thing to notice in this particular test here is that even though I'm using a lot of the normal processors, I'm not using what are known as virtual processors. Let's real quick compare that to what happens with the 16-inch MacBook Pro, and you'll see that it's giving me similar results. So the overall utilization is about the same. Neither machine can really peak it. You'll notice that here, though, the 2016 MacBook Pro is operating at around the 4 gigahertz range in this test, and it's maintaining that. And interestingly enough, that's actually a faster clock speed than I'm getting out of this. It's fairly close, but I think that even though this is a 3.5 gigahertz and the 16-inch MacBook Pro is only a 2.3 gigahertz, in this particular task, the MacBook Pro is actually operating at a slightly faster speed. So next, real quickly, let's take a look at the creation of one-to-one previews. And I'm just going to scroll through this test quite a ways. And what we want to look at here is how well it's utilizing the cores. And you can see that for the first part of this test, it wasn't great, but I wasn't bad, but there's a lot of this black area. And then right in this point here is when it, for some reason, it suddenly kicks in. And for the rest of the test, it's actually using almost 100% of the processor. Now, as we discussed in the last video, what Apple does in their activity monitor is they give each processor 100% value. Theoretical maximum usage would be 1200%. And if we look over here in the CPU percentage, we're seeing that it's running pretty close to that. Now, if you compare this to the 16-inch MacBook Pro, very similar performance at the very beginning. It's not quite as efficient. And then as it gets close to the end, it's a little more efficient. But of course, it has more cores, so it's operating at a 1500%. Now, understand that that doesn't really imply anything other than how it relates to its own processor. Just because it's doing 1600% and the other's doing 12 doesn't mean it's doing 33% more speed. That's simply a relative number that applies only to the machine you're testing on. But anyway, the 2013 Mac Pro does perform in a very similar manner and gives decent results. The difference, I think, is the RAM isn't working quite as fast. And again, if we look at the processor, here we're running at about a 3 gigahertz range. And I think in the Mac Pro, we'll see that it actually runs a little faster. So in the Mac Pro, it's actually able to maintain its rated speed. Anytime you're running something where it needs to run really maxing out the cores, the Mac Pro has a little bit of an advantage. But regardless of that, if we go to the end of the test, as we recall, it took 13 minutes for the Mac Pro to do it, and it only took 10 minutes and 36 seconds for the MacBook Pro. All of the other tests bear similar results. If I just quickly scroll through, let's go back to the Mac Pro. And this is the export test. And again, we'll see the Mac Pro is very good at that. Pretty good utilization of the cores, but it maintains its 3.5 gigahertz. One thing you never really see is this speed of the CPU very much. And moving on, we can go look at when we export the files, which means there's a lot of processing involved. Again, very good utilization. Nearly as good as the MacBook Pro. If we take a look at the MacBook Pro, very similar as far as their utilization. But the fact is the MacBook Pro has 8 cores and the Mac Pro only has 6. It would be interesting to find out if I think the Mac Pro originally might have been available in a 12-core version. It would be interesting to test that because obviously, based on what I'm seeing here, a lot of cores would help these functions in Lightroom. So if you have a 12-core Mac Pro, you might be outperforming in these particular tests. You might actually be outperforming the current 16-inch MacBook Pro, so maybe that would still be worth hanging on to. And then let's just take a look at the panorama merge test. And in the panorama merge test on the Mac Pro, as we go along and look at, you'll see that it's kind of like before. There are certain parts of that process which Lightroom leverages a lot of cores, and there are a lot of parts where it doesn't. Comparable results based on the other. Percentage-wise, it does about the same, and they look very similar. So the extra cores help it a little bit, and the extra RAM speed helps a little bit. So it does win the test. 6 minutes for the 16-inch MacBook Pro versus 8 minutes 33 for the Mac Pro. Last, let's look at Photoshop. If we run the Photoshop Puget system test, let's take a look on this is the Mac Pro. And as it runs the test, you'll see that it's very up and down. And whenever it's utilizing a lot of processors right here, there are times where it leverages a lot of the cores, and at times it gives a pretty good result. But if you look at this compared to the 16-inch MacBook Pro, very similar as far as its core utilization. The 16-inch MacBook Pro does win the test. You'll notice that the 16-inch MacBook Pro is able to run at almost 4.6 gigahertz during these areas of the test where you're mainly using one core, whereas the Mac Pro is not capable of running that fast. So it's running at 3.8. It really never can climb much higher than, I don't know if it ever gets 4 or not. Maybe we can just scroll through and see if we can ever see 4 pop up there. So max is 3.9, average is 3.6. And if we look at the MacBook Pro, max is 3.6, but average, like it right in here, max here is 440, average is 4. So really the MacBook Pro's processor, as far as gigahertz speed-wise, is outperforming the 3.5 gigahertz Mac Pro, even though the MacBook Pro's rated speed is only 2.3. One thing I think I've discovered on that is when they give you the rated speed and when they rate these chips, as they add processors or cores, the speed seems to be lower. So you can get a 4-core at a higher gigahertz than a 6-core. It's because the rating on the processor is based on what the speed is capable of if all cores are being used. That's I think the minimum speed you'll get. And obviously if you can keep it cool, it will clock. An interesting note to this, in the next version of the OS, Apple is going to release an update to the 16-inch MacBook Pro, and it might even apply to the 2019 MacBook Pro, which is going to be called Pro Mode. In the other video, I commented how they don't let the processor really get much more than 85 degrees. And I think what they're going to do is, if you want to go to the Pro Mode, and you understand that means the fans will run quite a bit faster and thus be a little noisier, they'll let that processor heat up closer to the 100-degree range, which will increase the performance. I'll be real interested to see what happens with these same 6 tests and compare if Pro Mode really does anything and how much it adds. Because to me, a little fan noise isn't that bad. The computer sits at probably 8 or 10 feet away from me. And, you know, the only time it's going to do it is when I'm really cranking on something anyway. So a little more fan noise might be great.
Well, that's a wrap on this video. Those of you that have a Mac Pro and have been wondering about a MacBook Pro, yes, maybe something you could consider. Now, I will admit that probably the current iMac Pros are outperforming any MacBook Pro. They're quite a bit more money, and if you're like me and you don't want a display, you want to use your own display, that's kind of doesn't leave you in a good spot. I don't know if you can. I don't know if there's any upgrade paths in these. I know that one of the problems is that the newer graphics cards really won't fit in this form factor anymore. So anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you subscribe to the channel down there and hit the like if you enjoyed the video. Helps me get a little better recommendations on YouTube. And until next time, hey, see ya.